Okay. I don't think there's a way to not look into the sun. Hi, everyone. Sorry, we have the sun right in our faces. Maybe if we move our seats forward. I don't know. Is that better? Sorry. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Perry World House. I'm Marie Harf, the executive director here. And actually, before we get started, we have this for a purpose. I may need to consult it during my questions. So I'm Marie Harf, Executive Director here at Perry World House. I think most of you know that we are the hub for global engagement at Penn. Thank you to folks who attended our event last night with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Nasser al-Qidwa, the former Palestinian foreign minister. It's Middle East Week here, apparently, at Perry World House. I am very honored personally and professionally to host today's book talk with Marc Lynch. He's professor of political science at the George Washington University and director of the Project on Middle East Political Science. He runs the popular blog and podcast, Abu Advark. I will say a point of personal privilege here. When I had my first job, I was a CIA analyst working on Saudi Arabia. I will tell you, every one of the analysts at the agency that worked on the Middle East religiously read Abu Advark. This was in 2005 is when I started. And it was like every morning you read it without fail. So if you don't subscribe or don't read it, it is still around, please do. We are here today to talk about his most recent book, which you can see a copy of right here. Yes, it's right there. America's Middle East, The Ruination of a Region. We're going to talk about that today. He is the author of several other books on the region as well. There were, when you walked in, sheets of paper with a QR code to order. The book is not actually out yet here in the United States, but will be soon, I hear. So I was very lucky to get a copy when you returned from the UK recently. So please get the piece of paper, buy the book, read it. I spent all weekend reading it, and it is a fantastic, difficult read, I think, and a necessary one for those of us who've worked on the Middle East over these past 20, 30, longer, in some cases years. It is a necessary read to talk about how we got here, and more importantly, the opportunities that we may have now. So Marc's going to give a book talk, and then I'm going to ask him questions, and we'll take questions from all of you. So with that, is the sun okay?
Great. Is this on? Okay.
Yes, you're good.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you all for coming out. It's great to be here. This is actually the first chance I've had to speak about the book in the United States. I did the original book launch. It came out in London a couple weeks ago, but as Marie said, it doesn't come out here in the U.S. until December 1st, and Trump's tariffs mean that it's prohibitively expensive for you to buy books until it comes out in the U.S. So so here we are. So America's Middle East. This book is one that I hadn't originally intended to write. For those of you who might have followed things I've written over the years, I typically have focused on the Middle East itself, and most of my analysis has been, I guess you would call it, from the inside out, looking at the Arab uprisings and proxy wars and the rise of the Arab public sphere. And so very much my career has been about the writing about the Middle East itself. And of course, America, the United States, is always there in the background, but I'd never actually written about US foreign policy before. But then, as with many people, I think what was happening in Gaza it just left me absolutely enraged. I was just absolutely furious over what the United States and what the Biden administration was doing in terms of supporting and enabling and doing very little to even mitigate the horrors that were unfolding in Gaza. And I'm not an angry guy usually. I'm pretty level-headed, I think, but I was just absolutely consumed with rage. I was a little embarrassed when the first review of the book came out, and the reviewer noted that I used the word rage. It's like 16 times on the first page, and so maybe that's a little bit overkill. But I was just absolutely furious. And so I started to write the book, and it was going to be about Gaza, but I quickly realized two things. One, that it would have a very short shelf life, and there were going to be lots of other books about Gaza, and it wasn't really my comparative advantage. But number two, that there's this idea that I think many of us have, which I think is perhaps a comforting idea, that Gaza is in some way an exception, that there's, yes, maybe some horrible things are happening in Gaza, but Gaza is somehow different from what is otherwise, a world governed by rules, by norms, by, with all the various things that we tell ourselves. But, I came of age writing about, so Marie was talking about the CIA reading my blog, but that's interesting to know. Mostly what I was writing about back then was Iraq, and a lot of my work for over a decade was, very finely grained analysis of Iraq as kind of the center of much of what I was doing. And as I was watching what American officials were saying about Gaza, as I was following the discourse in the media, as I was watching what was happening, I kept hearing echoes and ghosts of Iraq, of the inability, I think, to really take seriously the scope and scale of human suffering and devastation that was being caused in the case of Iraq quite directly by the United States. And the when I heard Joe Biden, say, he said, I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed, right? And then Biden says this as a way of deflecting responsibility. What it came back to me was thinking about Madeleine Albright talking about the effect of the sanctions on Iraq, and and I'm sure many of you have heard this quote before. She later said it was the thing she most regretted saying, but I think she meant it when she was asked on 60 Minutes about reports that up to 1 million children had died due to the effects of the sanctions. And she said, yes, it's a tough choice, but we think it's worth it. How could 1 million dead children be worth anything, right? And then there were the arguments about it. Say, well, maybe it's not really 1 million. The methodology is suspect. Maybe it's just 500,000. Like that made it better, right? And somehow the idea that 500,000 dead children would be morally acceptable in a way that 1 million wasn't. And then watching the arguments over Gaza, I felt I was living through it again. And I realized that what I wanted to write about was not Gaza, but I wanted to write about America and the Middle East as a whole. And United States has been in a position of basically uncontested dominance in the Middle East since 1991, since the end of the Cold War. We have had no serious great power peer competition in the Middle East in that time. It's probably the single greatest and most clear example of unipolarity at the global level, but as manifested in a particular region. Russia, China, Europe, there are no peer competitors. Since 1991, the United States, all roads have led through Washington. We have been close security and political allies with basically every regime in the Middle East, with the exception of Iran, which was, you all know about Iran, Syria, which under the Hafez al-Assad regime in the 1990s, tried very, very hard through the peace process to get into the American-led order and was unable to do so. Libya, which cashed in its weapons of mass destruction program and joined the American-led regional order. And other than that, the United States and Iraq, which the United States invaded, overthrew the government, and unleashed the hell on earth after 2003. But basically, every other government, every other regime in the Middle East is a close American security and political ally. And the United States has been in a position of not just being the dominant power in the region, but fundamentally, constitutively, deeply shaping the region and creating a structure. When I talk about America's Middle East, what I'm talking about is the Middle East that the United States made not from scratch, and certainly not in a way to say that there's no local agency, that the states themselves, the political movements themselves, don't act and try and take advantage and pursue their interests. They absolutely do. But they do so within a structure which is shaped by an American security guarantee, an American set of kind of rules and ideas which are very, very far from the ideas that we maybe have about liberal international order. Basically, the Middle East was constructed as a zone in which the liberal international order simply did not apply. None of the ideas about international law, about globalization, about human rights, about democracy, those were all set aside. And these are largely not they're often understood in the United States, in Washington, as things which we tried to do, but we failed. We tried to bring democracy to the Middle East, but we just couldn't do it. It must be some problem with Middle Arab culture or something. My basic argument is that the absence of democracy in the Middle East is necessary for the United States to do what it wants to do in the Middle East, which is to make sure the oil keeps flowing, protect Israel, and prevent any peer competitors from getting access to be able to disrupt the flow of oil or to threaten Israel. And so what I see when I look at the Middle East is a set of actors who are shaped by the necessity of playing a role within this Middle East. And there's no mystery about what the United States wants in the Middle East. It protect Israel and make sure the oil keeps flowing. In 1991, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, very self-consciously set about constructing this Middle East in such a way that it would lock in American hegemony. It was actually a very well-designed structure in which the peace process was essentially created as a way to make it possible for the Arab states on which the oil depended could be in de facto alignment with Israel. And the peace process essentially was a way of allowing that to happen. So they could, as long as there's progress towards peace, then Arab states that were technically in a state of war with Israel could cooperate with them against common threats like Iran, or more to the point, keeping themselves in power, which became the primary motivation for most Arab regimes. The 1990s were the peak of American primacy. This was the peak of the attempt to build this robust kind of American-led order. And it's fondly remembered in the United States, in Washington, as this is when America was good. This was when the Middle East was improving. And it was in many ways. I mean, I remember living in Jerusalem and being able to drive from East Jerusalem to Nablus to Jenin without encountering any roadblocks. I mean, there were things that were happening. But the 1990s were not a really great time in Iraq. This was the period of the sanctions, of dual containment. This was a time of tremendous human suffering in Iraq, which was largely just ridden away as keeping Saddam in his box and the cost of maintaining order. And in the 1990s, this was peak primacy. After that, we get the book goes kind of chapter by chapter, looking at the descent from the Bush-Clinton years down through the second Bush administration. Obama, who I paint as largely a tragic figure, who actually was trying to change the Middle East for the better with the way he approached the Arab Spring and the negotiations over the Iranian nuclear program. But the narrative that I give then is essentially one in which every American president comes into office trying to change the Middle East. There's always this recognition that the Middle East is not in good shape and that the United States is trapped in the Middle East and we need to pivot to Asia. We need to reduce our commitments. We need to reduce our investment. Every single president comes in, tries to do this, and fails. Every single president comes in and tries, and people forget that George W. Bush started off saying the United States was deeply overinvested in the Middle East and we needed to, I remember the wonderful line of Colin Powell's, the job of the U.S. military is not to escort kindergartners to school. Didn't work out that way with the occupation of Iraq. Obama wanted to right size, Trump wanted to right size, Biden wanted to pivot to Asia. None of them can do it. And so a lot of the book, the theoretical argument of the book, is about the structures which lock them into place, which hold every president again and again and again defaulting back to essentially the same strategies, the same alliances, and the same practices. And I want to just open this up and have a conversation about all of this. But I think that the bottom line on a lot of it is simply that America is as much a prisoner of America's Middle East as it is the architect of America's Middle East. That structure is not something which the United States imposed and then, in a sense, kind of runs like puppet master. So the obvious criticism of my book, the one that I know I'm going to get, and so I anticipated it and rebut it repeatedly in the book, is the idea that I'm just blaming America for everything, and it's just they're left wing, America's horrible and not. That's actually not the argument of the book at all. The argument of the book is about the local actors that we have created and empowered and protected and enabled, and who are often the ones who are locking us in and holding us into these consistently self-destructive and self-defeating policies again and again and again. And by those actors, I mean Israel, I mean the Gulf states, I mean all of our allies in the Middle East, which expect certain things from us and get very upset when we don't deliver on those things. The Arab Spring was enormously disruptive because Obama did not behave the way that the actors in the region expected him to behave. They wanted to see full support for our friends in the region and not this actual nonsense about trying to spread democracy. It is widely understood that this was just talk. And when Obama actually tried to do it, there was a fierce backlash from Israel, from the Gulf states, from all of our other allies in the region, which took it upon themselves to make sure that we would drag the region back into that autocratic reality. When the United States wanted to negotiate the JCPOA and try and break this cycle of conflict with Iran, it was the actors in the region which dragged the United States back. Israel, the Gulf states, wanted to have a particular set of conflictual relationships, and they lobbied and worked and did everything possible to make sure that we would revert back. And so what I'm going to end with is just to say that there's a belief out there, understandably, that the Trump administration is just like nuts, that Trump is just like, pursuing all these like crazy policies, and he's doing all kinds of crazy things. I'm not here to defend him, but in the Middle East, he has had an enormously traditional foreign policy. Everything Trump is doing follows directly from what Biden did. Everything Biden did followed directly from what Trump did before him. And basically, it is the same logic of America's Middle East. Build an enduring Israeli-Arab cooperation against Iran, preventing the emergence of any disruptive forces, whether terrorist groups or democracy, which might disrupt the smooth flow of that structure. And that's kind of where we are right now. I suppose not. I suppose we've just last week Trump declared peace in the Middle East, so I guess everything's changed now. So I'll probably have to add a new chapter to the book, I guess. But let me just stop there. And I know, Marie, you have a lot of questions, and I just want to have a chance to turn this into a discussion about all the many issues.
Thank you, Mark. And I will say, as someone who worked on some of these issues in the book, it is a really insightful, powerful read that makes you reconsider things you've either worked on or thought about for a long time. And I think that's valuable. We are going to end, I should note, at the end of the book, you say there is a potential for the future for it to be different. So we're going to end on that, but we're not going to get there quite yet. Mark, you very succinctly outline what United States leaders believe their interests are in the region and how they pursue those. If you were President Lynch, President, King, whatever, what would you argue America's interest actually should be in the region? And we can talk about tactics for pursuing those. But you outline, support for Israel, keeping oil flowing, fighting terrorism. What would you say our actual interests are in the region?
That's a great question, and I think that there has been this bipartisan consensus on the definition of those interests: protect the security and survival of Israel, and keep the oil flowing, and prevent the emergence of disruptive forces. Every administration has accepted those, and I wouldn't necessarily say they should be thrown out. But what I do think, though, is that the only way to have, and again, this is if I get to be king, I would say that the reason why it perpetually drags us back into conflicts and refuses to let the United States, kind of move on, is because we consistently enable and actually incentivize the kinds of policies that make us indispensable. I actually think that what the United States would be, the American interests would be best served by being able to have a region that could be stable and secure and relatively conflict-free without the need for the United States to be constantly involved in policing its disputes and supporting its autocratic regimes. I think that during the Arab Spring, I thought the Obama, approach to this was basically right in the sense of you need to take the perennial conflict with Iran off the table and find a way. I think it was actually Rob Malley who got in so much trouble for saying this, but then Obama said it as well. That trying to find kind of a sustainable balance of power between Iran and the rest of the region, which did not require the United States to basically be policing and enforcing it. And the JCPOA is a tactic, but in terms of what are American interests, I would say that the first interest should be to create a region in which we don't have to engage in regular military interventions and we don't have to support governments which engage in systematic human rights abuses. I would say that if we were willing to allow for genuine democratic transitions in these countries, initially they would then vote for policies which would be not what America would like to see. But over time, you would then build relationships with those societies which don't depend on maintaining autocratic regimes that are pursuing highly unpopular policies. And so ultimately, American interest should be that the Middle East would be populated, as other regions of the world are, by countries that are more or less democratic and with whom we don't need to be constantly, funneling weapons and support and violating international law and human rights standards in order to keep them in power because we're pursuing policies that are at odds with the preferences of the vast majority of the population. And then finally, kind of in terms of, and that would also, I think, go to the disruptive forces category. So I think the United States should have a lower military presence in the region. I think that the goal should be to create the kinds of countries that are able to become, democracies and participate within the international system on those terms. And then that would hopefully then involve Israel being safe and secure within an environment where the fundamental needs and demands of the Palestinian people are also met. Whether that I don't think a two-state solution is actually possible anymore, but I do think that there are.
Don't think it's possible.
I don't think it's possible anymore. I think we live in, as Ian Lustig has said, we live in a one-state reality, and I think that what would have to happen to get to a two-state solution is so far from what is possible right now that we can't really get there. But whatever the arrangement is, if you have an arrangement by which Palestinians are able to live as fully equal human beings with all the rights that entails, then Israel would be in a much more secure and safe place, but not on the current model of perpetual military, perpetual war, perpetual domination, perpetual militarism. And essentially, the United States, America's Middle East, is basically ensuring that you cannot change that logic of domination and violence, and both at the international level, but also within states themselves. So I guess that maybe this is overly idealistic, and it would take a long time to get there. But I think that if you flip the question around and you say, okay, we've spent 35 years, kind of doing it this way, is the Middle East a good place? Does the Middle East look like a happy place? It has the lowest level, it has some of the, look at every developmental indicator, look at the economic situation, look at the political situation. It is one of the worst regions on earth in terms of the amount of violence, the level of economic development, the degree of democracy. And a lot of people, they just want to treat these as two separate things. On the one hand, the United States is in a position of dominance and using its power to maintain order. On the other hand, you have all of these failed states, wars, terrorism, economic collapse, corruption, all these things, as if those two things are unrelated. And my argument is essentially that the United States has helped to create, sustain, and exacerbate all of those problems while getting very little in return. And so that's why I think I would like to see a reconceptualization. I also think it's not going to happen. And that is unfortunate.
I want to pick up on one of the pieces of what you just said, and that a goal should be to have less American military intervention in the region. I think many people, I don't want to say most people would agree with that, but many people would agree with that. Administrations of both parties and leaders have said that, as you mentioned. So I want to talk to you about another tool in the American policymaking toolbox, and that's sanctions. Because a lot of people in government will say, we don't want to go to war. You're right. We don't want to commit troops. We don't want to send the military. So we're going to try sanctions. And you are very hard on sanctions in this book. And I want to talk about that a little bit. Mike, I guess I have a couple of questions. The first is, are sanctions ever okay or useful? What does that look like? But then if they're not, or if they are, what are the kinds of tools the United States does have to try to promote change in the region? We don't want to take the military off the table. You know, what do you do with an Iran that is in many ways challenging American interests? Sanctions have human consequences, of course, but what are the other options? So I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit, because you are very hard on sanctions in this book.
I am hard on sanctions on the book, and I think a lot of it comes out of my history of working on the Iraq issue. But I think you have to be very careful about what you mean by sanctions, though, because there's different types of sanctions. And so, back in when people finally belatedly began to recognize the toll that the sanctions were taking on Iraq, you saw the shift right around 1999, 2000, 2001 towards this idea of smart sanctions. And the idea being that you would target your sanctions so that they would hit very specific networks and leaders and organizations and that sort of thing.
With exceptions for medicine and things like that.
Exactly. And so I'm less critical of those types of sanctions, but they just don't work. They rarely bring about the intended effects. But the kind of sanctions, though, that I'm extremely critical of are the kinds that you see being used again and again and again, and they consistently have the opposite effect of the intended effect. And that was on Iraq, that was on Syria, that was on Iran, that's on Gaza. And basically, all of these kinds of comprehensive blockade-style sanctions, they always have the same result, which is that they tend to strengthen the regime in power and immiserate the societies that are being dominated by it. So you look at the sanctions or the Israeli blockade of Gaza since 2005, and what it meant was essentially that Hamas, as the power controlling Gaza, was in a position to monopolize the black market, to control the tunnels, and it meant that anybody who wanted anything done needed to work through Hamas. The blockade very clearly strengthened Hamas at the expense of Palestinians in Gaza. In Iraq, the sanctions empowered and stabilized the Saddam Hussein's regime, but the same way. It allowed them to monopolize the black markets, and to basically make the entire society increasingly dependent. The more miserable people got, it was not that they would get more miserable and then they would rise up and overthrow. It was that they became more miserable, and that made them more dependent on the regime, which captured all of the rents and then distributed them back as a form of patronage. So in other words, the sanctions were often, and the same thing with maximum pressure on Iran under.
Do you think under Obama there was any truth to the argument many of us made that those sanctions brought them to the negotiating table?
I think that, I mean, yes, you can increase the pain, and that can bring them to the negotiating table if there's an end game involved. But what happens is that it often becomes kind of a self-perpetuating thing. It's like there's sanctions on Iran, there will always be sanctions on Iran. There's sanctions on Palestine, there will always be sanctions on Gaza. And so that gives no incentive for them to change their behavior. If the sanctions are targeted and if they are linked to a specific political goal, then they certainly have a place. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have foreign policy tools, but what I've seen again and again in the Middle East is, and probably elsewhere, but I don't study those other places, is that they become their own, this kind of self-perpetuating, kind of tool. It's like, if Iran is not doing what we want them to do, then we need to find ways to increase the pain. As opposed to what Obama was doing, was saying, look, the pain is increasing, but we are offering you this negotiating process by which you can escape that pain,
right,
and move in a direction that we would like to see you go. That was not an offer that was ever offered to Saddam Hussein.
Right.
That was not an offer that you saw in Gaza, and I think with the maximum pressure part of the sanctions on Iran.
Well, and it was also, I mean, speaking to your point about the structural forces in American domestic politics as well, you link American domestic politics to our positions in the Middle East. When we would make the argument to Congress in both parties, you passed sanctions saying they were designed to get Iran to the negotiating table and to get a deal, and then we got the deal, and they said, wait, no. These were never intended to actually be taken off. It's like, well, then what was the actual point of them? That was a structural constraint that Congress said one thing, and when we actually got a deal, they kind of took it back.
So look at Gaza right now. You have a ceasefire in place, a shaky ceasefire, and there's talk of of surging humanitarian aid in. And God, I hope that they do. It's not really happening yet, but like anything which would alleviate the suffering there is great. And vitally necessary, given the absolute, complete, and total devastation and destruction of Gaza, rendered a completely uninhabitable place by the last 2 years of war and destruction. So an end of violence and surging of humanitarian aid are all good things. But in a sense, they don't touch the core of the problem,
Right.
which is that as long as Gaza simply remains under blockade, you can't have normal development. You can't have the emergence of kind of normal politics, economy, or society as long as you have the complete control, external control over the movement of people and goods. And so that, maybe that's a phase 2 or a phase 3 thing. I don't think we'll ever get there, but that to me is going to be the indicator of whether you can see meaningful change or not. If the idea is simply to restore Gaza to something like pre 2023 with a different governing, a different, kind of set of actors governing it, but you maintain the blockade, then it's just you're just resetting the clock and starting over again. And that's pretty much what I expect is going to happen. But again,
Hope.
gotta hope.
Gotta hope. I want to talk a little bit about our allies, U.S. allies, I should say. You write, as Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others show every day, Washington is not even able to force its most dependent allies to go along with its preferences on important issues. Can you talk about that a little bit? And what I've thought about this a lot. What are American policymakers so scared of?
Well, I mean, I think it's really
Push back when allies don't.
I mean, so your experience in the Obama administration, I think it's one of the clearest and most obvious cases of this, where and this is when, and I wrote about this in my earlier books as well. This is the period when the president of the United States is defining American interests as supporting democratic transitions during the Arab Spring and getting to the negotiating table with Iran. And every single one of our major allies in the region is actively working against both of those goals. And they're doing it both on the ground in the region by, in the case of the Arab Spring, actively intervening to thwart those transitions and to restore autocracy, such as sponsoring the military coup in Egypt.
And we didn't call it a coup. Right. The coup.
You should have, though.
The coup.
Yes, the coup. Yes.
Different issue.
Yes, I can call it a coup because it was a coup. Um, and then, but also working very hard in Washington and working very hard in all aspects of the political system. And so that you see that with Israel, of course, and when you have the Prime Minister of Israel addressing a joint session of Congress denouncing President Obama and arguing against the nuclear agreement, well, that does send a message. In terms of the ways in which our closest allies are actively working to thwart our avowed goals. And again, when was the last time that you saw any kind of smooth or easy ability of the United States to get Israel to do anything Israel didn't want to do? One of the big changes, and this is it's a real change, and it's not one that I think other people who might write this kind of book would discount this. I actually don't, and that's the increasing autonomy of the Gulf states and their willingness to act in the ways that they act. I think in the early, if you go back to when the Gulf states, the GCC was formed in the 1980s, go back to the 1990s. There was very much a sense of them being utterly dependent, proxy relationship, patron-client types of relations. But now, when you hear the self-confidence coming out of Abu Dhabi or out of Riyadh, what you listen to Mohammed bin Salman, you listen to Mohammed bin Zayed, they don't consider themselves to be proxies or clients. They consider themselves to be middle powers on a par with South Africa, Brazil. They want to be taken seriously, and they act in that way. And yet, you need to understand that the only thing which allows them to act in that way is the ongoing American provision of internal and external security guarantees. In other words, they are very much creatures of the structure that we've created. And when they're pushing back against the United States, it's very often about their perception that the United States is deviating from those agreed upon rules of the game. The United States is supposed to be confronting Iran. The United States is supposed to be preventing democratic change and supporting its allies. And when the United States attempts to change policy, you get more and more effective pushback. I think that in the 1990s, you would not have had the Gulf states being either able or willing to constrain Washington the way that they are now.
And can you talk a little bit about what that constraining looks like? What American policymakers, they put a policy in place, they get pushback from Israel or Saudi Arabia or the UAE. What does that look like? And what are they so scared of that they don't feel like they can overcome that?
Now you tell me.
Your book. Well, no, is it look, there's some obvious possibilities, right? Domestic politics.
No, yeah. So there's a number.
Are we worried they're going to be closer to China? Right.
Mm-hmm. No, there's a number of things. So the closer to China is actually a really interesting one because one of the tools, one of the tactics over the last decade has very much been the kind of the flirtation with other great powers and kind of the veiled threat of defection from the American-led alliance system. And it really is just a game, though. Everybody knows that this is not a realistic possibility. There's zero chance that Saudi Arabia is going to say, okay, we're kicking out the United States and we're going to now become a Chinese ally. That's not going to happen. China has zero interest in doing it and zero capability to implement it. And the entire extremely expensive arsenal that we have sold them over the years is completely based on American weapon systems and ammunition and spare parts and all these things. There's enormous sunk costs in America's Middle East so the threat of defection was a useful bargaining tool in Washington that was consumed with the idea that we're fighting a global Cold War with China, but it wasn't a serious threat. In terms of, but that is one possibility. The other is, as you said, domestic politics. And there you have kind of the lobbying of Congress, the very effective lobbying of Congress by pro-Israel organizations and increasingly by Gulf states. So even if the president wants to do something, Congress can act as a check on that. Look at the JCPOA and the fate of the JCPOA and the inability to get that done as a treaty and that sort of thing. But then there's also, and the book talks about this a bit, there's also knowledge production. And what we've seen over the last, for a very long time, of course, there's been, kind of what I call I don't think I tiptoe around anything in the book. No. I don't think I use precise wording, but there's like the weird politics around Israel, which have gotten more intense since October 7th, but have always been there, that makes it very difficult to kind of discuss openly a lot of things related to Israeli-Palestinian issues. But what's less understood is the way that Gulf states have essentially purchased up most of the real estate in the American think tank world and universities and invested heavily in knowledge production. So, if the United States decides that it's going to try and say, for example, do something, about restraining civilian nuclear energy development in the Gulf or weapon sales. They want to restrict certain weapon sales to, say, the UAE. You can be quite sure that there's going to be a torrent of think tank publications and reports that are going to be heavily lobbied and circulated through Congress that explaining why nuclear energy is a good thing to have in the Gulf and why and basically like pro-Gulf positions. And if you ask the people in the think tanks, they will say, well, we truly believe these things, right? We're not for hire, we're not guns for hire. But the fact is that when every think tank in town is owned or is heavily dependent upon a steady flow of money from the Gulf, they are unlikely to select fellows who are known for their anti-Saudi positions, and they are unlikely to decide that those topics are worthy of discussion. And there's a very clear silencing effect in the production of knowledge around a lot of these issues in ways that are, kind of invisible to the naked eye, but are very clear in terms of the way that discussion and debate and media coverage kind of evolves and emerges. And a lot of it is just, Ian Lustig taught me a lot about hegemony and how hegemony works. And one of the ways that hegemony works is, power is when, if nothing happens, you get your way, right? If nothing happens, the results are in line with your interests. And one of the features of America's Middle East is that most of its features are simply common sense. They're simply obvious. They don't even need to be defended. You don't even need to, like, why would you need to defend the idea that the United States is essential for providing order and stability to the Middle East? I mean, it's obvious, right? Why would you need to defend the idea that the United States must, show, no daylight between the American and Israeli governments? That's obvious. Of course, that's the way it should be. And when things don't have to be challenged, when they don't have to be discussed, or when there is systematic shaping of the knowledge production environment to make sure that they're not discussed, then that ideological hegemony continues. What's fascinating, and I guess we want to seg into what's changed and why this time might be different, is that those things are now being discussed openly in ways that they were not before. I actually think that we're in a period right now where all the major pillars of America's Middle East are not gone, but they are exposed in ways that they were not before. I think that this rests on American global primacy. I think America is rapidly losing that primacy. I think that the Trump administration is kind of speed walking a process that was already underway in terms of America's, declining place in the world and the stripping away of all of our soft power assets and USAID and broadcasting and all those other things, but also setting us up for, and here I'm just going to throw this out there, that we're clearly heading for an AI bubble collapse, which is going to be another global financial crisis. And I think that that is going to be catastrophic for what remains of America's kind of global position. And then in terms of this ideological consensus, I think there's been a sea change in terms of American politics surrounding Israel. It's just, it's
Because of Gaza.
because of Gaza. And the Democratic Party today, Democratic Party politics on Israel are unrecognizable from even 5 years ago, and that's changing rapidly. And there's a lot of these things that in the past would have held America's Middle East and kind of drag everyone back to the center. A lot of those things are changing, I think, in interesting ways. But where it leads to, it's really hard to know. Trump is in many ways a kind of a unique figure in that he is simply seems to be completely unaffected by the normal rules of politics, right? He doesn't need AIPAC's support in controlling Congress or raising money. He, is, basically the normal rules of politics don't seem to apply. And I've never seen, in all of my days of studying the Middle East and working on it, I've never seen an image like the image that emerged of Netanyahu in the Oval Office with Trump on the phone apologizing to the Emir of Qatar, an image that was filmed to make it as humiliating as possible for Netanyahu as he's reading a script and Trump is holding the phone, that the base of the phone. This is impossible. No American president would ever dare to do that. And yet Trump did it and got the results that he wanted. And that's quite interesting that, thinking about not just the image itself, but what it suggests about the shifting possibilities in America's Middle East. Whether that survives Trump, I do not know, but things are clearly changing.
I want to take some audience questions now. While I wait for you to raise your hands, I just want to read one of the best lines in the book. I know you like this one too. Colin Powell's famous Pottery Barn rule, if you break it, you own it, seemed like an ethical position for many in Washington. They rarely asked if the broken pottery actually wanted to be owned. I mean, it should also follow that you shouldn't break the pottery to begin with. But it's those kinds of lines spread throughout this book, which is why I'm telling all of you to buy it. It takes a very clear look at some conventional wisdom that a lot of us just have repeated for decades. So let's take some questions. Yes. David's going to come to you with the microphone, please.
Thank you so much for coming. I had a question regarding a cycle you described. It seemed like the US and other countries in the region have been stuck in a cycle regarding peace and how to achieve it. I think you talked about how some Arab countries are incentivized to keep it going because they might benefit in some way or form. But you've also mentioned how the U.S. has been dragged back and forth through the conflicts as it's been through in the region. And I was wondering, in the past 2 years, the cycle, you could argue, has been broken. Do you think there is an opportunity for us to move forward? And what should the US's role be in breaking the cycle and ensuring we have lasting peace in the region?
No, it's a great question, and Maria and I were talking about this last night. It's a real tension in the book because the argument that I make is essentially one where the structure that we've created has trapped us in this doom loop, I suppose you might call it, and that so the logic of my argument should say this too shall pass, and I think that a lot of people are making the gamble that once the ceasefire is in effect now, that even if it doesn't really hold, doesn't have to turn into stable and lasting peace. All it needs is to get Gaza off the headlines, and then we can go back to normal, go back to the way things were. And I think that that's the gamble that a lot of people are making. In an earlier version of this book, I was centered much more on the idea that Gaza is the equivalent of Suez Crisis for the British Empire. That it's the moment when basically it's revealed to everybody that the age of empire is over. That 1956 in Suez, that basically up until then it was inconceivable that there wouldn't be a British Empire, and after that it was just gone. And I think that Gaza is that moment for the United States. I think that that's when too many things were brought to the surface and revealed, and it's caused too many changes, caused and revealed too much about the reality of America's Middle East for it to continue as it went before. And I think I have the line in the book where I say, when America's Middle East passes, it will die alone, unmourned, and unloved, and will be remembered as little as the British Empire is today. And the Middle East will continue without was it Churchill who was like, who said, or Churchill or de Gaulle, one of them said the cemeteries are full of indispensable men, and I kind of feel the same way about empires. But that said, to get back to your question, that change is possible. It doesn't mean that change is going to be for the better, right? So that's the real. I do feel that we're seeing irreversible change in the way that America's Middle East functions, the role of the United States, and kind of how it defines its interests and everything else. Whether that leads to a better Middle East, I think, is very much in question. Like the direction that the Trump administration seems to want to take it is not one that I think is a better one. If the new Middle East is going to essentially be, see kind of you'll see a lot of discussion in the Israeli media now about the idea that now Israel's a new regional hegemon, and it basically is able to enforce order through air power, striking with impunity wherever it likes. And if the new Middle East is one in which the Palestinian issue fades away once again, Saudi Arabia is coerced or attracted into something like the Abraham Accords, although they'll call it something different, with Israel. The Palestinian issue continues to fester unresolved, and Israel's military hegemony becomes the replacement for American active interventionism. That would be a different Middle East, but it would not be a better Middle East, and certainly not the one that I would like to envision. So I can see a lot of roads to change, which are not going to lead where I would like to see it go. And unfortunately, my experience is that that's probably what's going to happen. But I'd also think that there's reason to, keep fighting and, to try and, push that change. I think the change is inevitable. It's just a question of what type of change it's going to be.
Other questions? Yes, I'll come here and then to you, and then Majid, I'll come over to you.
I'll try to keep my answers shorter. Sorry.
Thank you so much for being here, obviously. But so throughout the talk, you mentioned that despite the fact that U.S. has historically tried to improve the region, it's still very war-torn, has a lot of conflict. But then I would point to, for example, the Gulf countries, and it might be biased because I'm from Saudi Arabia, but I would say that there's a very high standard of living in these countries. But then there's also war-torn regions in the Middle East. So there's this very big difference in conditions, despite the fact that all these countries are in the Middle East and have had U.S. intervention in some way. Do you think this could somehow be explained by difference in U.S. foreign policy between these two groups, like the Gulf countries and countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon?
Yeah, no, the Middle East is not a homogenous area right now. And basically, North Africa is almost completely detached at this point. The Gulf, at least the wealthy, the wealthy citizens in the Gulf are doing quite well. And basically the entire heartland of the Middle East, the entire Levant, is just basically sinking into an abyss. And so there's a huge gap there. And my previous book, The New Arab Wars, was all about like the new international relations that creates, where you see kind of the surviving powerful states, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, Iran, actively intervening and competing in kind of the smoldering ruins of the failed states and the collapsed states. And that I think that still is very much the way the region looks right now. I think that the kind of the in many ways when I look at like Qatar, UAE, especially those two, they almost don't feel like you're in the Middle East anymore. I mean, I wrote about this in Foreign Affairs a couple years ago. It's like we should be seeing them as kind of entrepôts of global capital, rather than as part of the Middle East in many ways. I mean, they are absolutely pivotal nodes in global transit, global finance. Now they're moving heavily into AI data centers and all of these things. And they're just in a completely different world from, as you said, from Beirut, from Damascus, from Amman. I think that Mohammed bin Salman is trying very hard and having remarkable success, I would say, at kind of dragging Saudi Arabia into becoming a normal Arab autocracy, right? And eliminating many of the things which made Saudi Arabia distinctive under its previous leaders. And I think that is very much part of wanting to kind of move in that direction. So, but it's interesting though, because politically, despite this economic and social detachment from the Middle East, you also see more active political interventionism and military interventionism than you ever saw before. I mean, if you had said to someone back in the 1990s that the fate of Libya was going to be determined by the competitive intervention of Qatar and the UAE, you would have been laughed out of the room. It would have made no sense whatsoever. But now that's just kind of the way things are. And so I do think that you've seen very real detachment there. But I think that one of the things which is most interesting, though, is that American security umbrella, right? It's not something that a lot of people in the Gulf like to think of this as something which is happening independently of the United States. And, basically they are now rising up and challenging and they're independent, but they're not. They're still embedded within that regional security architecture that the United States has created, for better or for worse. And that's what gives them the kind of the security and the stability to make these shifts that I was describing. But I think that the way that this evolves is one of the most important things about kind of where the Middle East is going. And the gamble, Mohammed bin Salman's gamble about whether or not he can transform Saudi Arabia, is probably more important than a lot of the things that I've been talking about.
Let's go up here to us.
Oh, but since Sos is about to talk, I'll say that, whether Iran continues to be kind of the external boogeyman that holds this all together, or is in some way integrated into kind of the regional security architecture, is probably the single biggest other thing. And again, it's very interesting to see that, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have largely, they've normalized with Iran. They've lost interest. Like when the Abraham Accords were signed, I and a lot of other people thought this was going to be basically turning the UAE into a forward operating base to attack Iran. And that is very much not the mood in the Gulf anymore. And that's really interesting.
Thank you, Mark. Congrats on the book. Looking forward to reading it. I don't know if you addressed this particular point I'm about to make, but I wonder what you think about it more at the micro level, and that's the policy process. There's a reason why this structure has been created around the Middle East that has this kind of very mutually reinforcing corrosive impact, both on the foreign policies of countries in the region, but also the United States. And that is that it's been a very lucrative policy process around it. You have revolving doors of all kinds between policy personnels, from the Foreign Service to defense contractors to lobbyists, management consultants, et cetera. Do you address this in the book? How much is that being disrupted right now, or is that simply being replaced by a new set of profit-seeking actors with a Trump administration's personalist approach. And how much does this kind of take us back to this infamous line by Benjamin Disraeli that the East is a career?
Um, yes, I don't talk about it as much in the book. Other people have written about it, but I think the revolving door is like, it's a real thing. I mean, some people leave an administration and they take up an academic job, and that's wonderful. A lot of them, they become lobbyists. They run Middle East policy for multiple administrations, and then they join a Saudi venture fund and get rich. And there's a lot of boards that are full of retired generals and boards of and ambassadors. And I think that's a very key part of how Washington works. And one thing to keep in mind is that, it's like one of the things which has evolved over the last like 10, 15 years, I think, is that the Gulf is the only place in the world that has any money. And that has a real structuring effect on a lot of the things that I'm talking about. But it also it is a new factor in some ways. Now, what does Trump do to that? Well, again, this is that falls into the speculative realm of who knows. But I think that the naked transactionalism and kind of the personal rent seeking is something which you did not see that with previous presidents. And I think like the crypto deals and the hotels and all of that, I just don't know if that's a structural change or if that's just it passes with Trump, assuming Trump ever leaves. I just don't know. I've seen no disruption of the revolving door. And I do think that is one of the things that helps lock all of this into place.
I'm going to give the last question to Majid over here.
Marc, thank you for this book. I look forward to reading it. Both you and Maria touched on whether China would be a possible actor that would grow its influence in the region. What I've seen there is that their influence has grown considerably in the last 5 to 7 years. But if the U.S. were to step back as a hegemon in the region, and even if it's not China, there would be a vacuum, and other actors would be, as you say, attracted to the money, attracted to being influential in the region, which may also not be a good thing. I just wanted to raise that point.
No, it's a fascinating point. I say in the book, and I've written about this in a number of different places, that from kind of a conventional international relations theory perspective, a realist perspective, China's willingness to continue to free ride on the United States in the Gulf in particular is one of the great puzzles. I mean, it really is quite remarkable that China, typically, if you are highly dependent on natural resources from a region, you're going to develop military capabilities to protect that. And the importance of Gulf gas and oil to Asian economies is obvious and extreme. And yet, we have not seen China developing the kind of blue water Navy capabilities or local basing capacity to actually act. And then, so you're right, they're much more present than they used to be in fascinating ways. They have strategic partnership agreements with every country in the Gulf and much of the Middle East. There's, Chinese businessmen are everywhere making deals and, investing. And, it's really interesting to see like the growing presence of Chinese actors at all levels. But then, when Gaza breaks out, it's like, okay, what is the Chinese position on this? Nobody knows. Nobody cares, right? A lot of people were hoping that China would step up and act, and China just didn't. Even when the Houthis started blockading the Red Sea and disrupting shipping, and if there's anything China should care about, it should be maintaining open shipping lanes because that's what they need out of the Middle East. And yet they did nothing. They have this base in Djibouti. They contributed a little bit to they've done the anti-piracy things, but when it came time to saying, okay, by threatening shipping to out of the Red Sea, you are infringing on vital Chinese national interests, and we need to use our influence, whether it's political, economic, or military, to stop you from doing it, they were invisible. And again, to me, this is something of a mystery. I mean, at one level, I think it's the same it's the same old thing, right? Where it's entirely rational for them to free ride on the American provision of security. Let the United States exhaust its resources, its blood and treasure, and make sure the oil keeps flowing, mostly to China's benefit. Makes total sense. But what I don't see as making sense is the point at which it is no longer obvious that the United States is able or willing to provide that public good. And I think that's where we are right now. I think that I think the biggest moment that Americans don't remember in the Middle East in the last decade is probably when there was the attack on the Abqaiq oil refineries in Saudi Arabia, and Trump really didn't do anything in response. And it's like, they're attacking the oil and the United States doesn't do anything. That was shocking to the Saudis, shocking to the entire Gulf. It should have been shocking to China. And yet no real change in Chinese naval presence or behavior in the region. So it's one of those things where, to me, it seems obvious and inevitable that China is going to emerge as a strategic presence in the Gulf. I think the rest of the Middle East they could care less about, and they care about North Africa as a gateway to Africa. They care about Egypt as a again as a gateway into Africa, but Israel, Palestine, the Syria, Lebanon, they really don't care. And why should they? But in the Gulf, one would expect that China is going to emerge as a major strategic presence, and yet they just haven't. And it's fascinating to me that they're in a sense under investing in that. So people have asked, like, when would you know if there's been a change in the regional order? And we spitball all kinds of ideas, and people would talk about, if the U.S. Israeli alliance broke, or if I actually think that China getting a serious naval base in the Gulf would be like a key moment when you would say, okay, we now have a structural change. It's no longer a unipolar American region. If China is able to acquire a base and then use it the way that one uses naval bases, then I think we would no longer be in America's Middle East anymore. And I think that day is coming. And I think sooner rather than later, but hasn't happened yet. But it's a really important question.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more minutes. Mark, I could talk up here all day. Just for the audience, things you're looking for over the next few weeks, months, particularly related to Gaza. Let's end where you started and where the rage brought you to write this book. What are you looking for?
So look, I was very happy to give Donald Trump credit for doing what Biden could have done a year ago and refused to do, which is to basically get a ceasefire, end the worst of the killing, get an agreement on humanitarian aid. I think that the terms of this deal are very, very similar to the January deal, very, very similar to what Biden was being discussed and negotiated, 6 months before that. So I think Trump deserves real credit for dragging Israel to the table and imposing this. And so that's great. But every aspect of what follows is extremely unrealistic and unlikely to ever be implemented. And so one of the big things, what am I looking for? There's this talk right now that until of making the disarmament and basically removal of Hamas a precondition for moving to phase 2. If it's a precondition for moving to phase 2, we're never moving to phase 2. Hamas is going to exist in Gaza in some form, and there is no alternative provider of security or of governance. And it's been fascinating to watch because you've seen, since the ceasefire, you've seen Hamas going out there and reestablishing order and, shooting the Israeli-backed militias and basically saying, hey, look, we're still here. And I think in Israel, this has been extremely controversial. It's a big political issue for Netanyahu that Hamas is acting in this way. And Trump basically was like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's good. Which is interesting, seeing that different approach. So the attitude towards the disarmament and removal of Hamas is going to be a big one. There's repeated ceasefire violations on both sides, mostly by Israel. And this is, whether that is allowed to continue and become the new normal, the new status quo, that's what we have to watch. I expect that it will. I expect that we're going to see a ceasefire, which is going to be violated 50 times a week. And you're going to still, and it's going to be a very violent and unstable ceasefire. But if that locks in as a new equilibrium, then, that's a new normal. I think that's probably that's my expectation of what it's going to end up looking like. That brings us to to me, the biggest thing, which is, does the humanitarian aid flow? Is humanitarian aid obstructed, or is it allowed in? Is it delivered? Do you see meaningful changes in the quality of life of Gazans who are? It's mind-boggling to me that in all the talk and celebration of the ceasefire, the actual physical devastation of Gaza has largely faded from the scene. It's like, okay, well, now we have peace. It's like virtually every building in Gaza has been destroyed. There are no hospitals, there are no schools, there are no roads, there's no water purification plants, there's no sewers, there's no, there's no agricultural land for farming, there's no food, there's absolutely nothing that would allow for life in Gaza right now. And so humanitarian aid is the first step, but it's not enough, because all that can do is keep people from dying. It can't actually begin the regeneration of the society. And so everybody is watching the flow of humanitarian aid, and you see this like in the daily, Haaretz, and the day 7 Israel at war, day 794 or whatever. They're tracking the number of trucks that get in, and that's important. They should be. What I'm tracking is, are you seeing any kind of meaningful opening of the blockade of Gaza, which would allow for not just humanitarian assistance, but reconstruction materials, and the ability to actually start moving from putting Band-Aids on wounds to actually starting the surgery? And right, that's phase 2. But if phase 2 is endlessly deferred by ceasefire violations and the demands to disarm Hamas, then we're going to head very much on this like negative trajectory forever. Not forever, nothing's forever, but you know what I mean.
Is that a good place to stop?
I guess.
Please, I know we're 10 minutes over. We could talk all day. Please join me
Thank you
in
all. Thank you
thanking
all.
Marc Lynch. Thank you for coming today. We have some more events coming up this semester, but please do take a look at the book, get the sheet, and order it when it's out on December 1st. Hey, there you go. Even better.